If you're from the US, you'll probably remember today's fallen business for that late-night run for a sick kid, or the last-minute birthday card, or the ice cream that always made things better. For 60 years, that was Rite Aid, always there. That was until October 3rd, 2025, when the lights behind that familiar red and blue sign finally went out. Forever. Once a fixture near town, Rite Aid is now just a ghost.
Pharmacy giant Rite Aid has announced it's officially closed all of its stores.
My play is Rite Aid. Shares getting crushed today on the heels of its latest earnings report.
This video isn't the story of a quiet closing. It's about a loud, catastrophic collapse brought on by a mountain of debt, 2 failed mergers, and a series of shocking lawsuits. It's the story of how yet another trusted American pharmacy giant was brought to its knees, and how its demise serves as a chilling warning for its biggest rivals. Rite Aid's story began in 1962 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, when Alex Grass opened a small health and beauty store called the Thrifty Discount Store. Grass was ambitious, aiming for growth at all costs. He quickly began buying other local pharmacies, gaining a foothold in 5 states by 1965. Then, in 1968, the company, now renamed Rite Aid, went public on the American Stock Exchange. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Rite Aid's strategy was relentless expansion. It swallowed up chains across the country, piling on debt to fuel its acquisitions. Their pharmaceutical rivals, Walgreens and CVS, were doing the exact same thing, and the reason for that was simple. If you get bigger, gain a significant market share, and grow in scale, you can negotiate better prices from drug manufacturers and suppliers. For a while, it worked. By the 1990s, Rite Aid had cemented its position as the 3rd largest drugstore chain in the United States, a seemingly permanent fixture in the American retail landscape. The company made its largest and most ambitious acquisitions in the mid-90s, buying Michigan-based Perry drugstores in 1994, and then Thrifty Payless, a massive chain on the West Coast, in 1996. These moves doubled Rite Aid's size, but also massively increased its debt load. Then came a near-fatal blow that had nothing to do with competition. In 1990, the company had been accused of accepting bribes, charges that were eventually dismissed. Then, in 2002, the company was rocked by a massive accounting scandal that saw Alex Grass's son and CEO of the company, Martin Grass, plead guilty to conspiracy and sentenced to prison. The scandal sent the company into a financial tailspin, and it spent the better part of a decade just trying to stabilize. But the underlying strategy never changed. In 2007, it bought the Brooks and Eckerd chains, adding another 1,000 stores and another few billion dollars in debt. Rite Aid was playing a high-stakes game of financial leverage, betting that it could grow its way out of trouble. But that debt was making the company sick from the inside. By the mid-2010s, Rite Aid was in a precarious position. It was saddled with billions in debt and was a distant third to its much larger competitors, CVS and Walgreens. They were bleeding cash and desperately needed a lifeline. That came in October 2015, when Walgreens announced it would buy up Rite Aid in a blockbuster deal. The plan was to merge into a true competitor to CVS, a move that would have solved Rite Aid's scale problem overnight, and possibly Walgreens. But the deal never happened. Federal regulators were worried the merger would create a duopoly in the pharmacy market, and after 2 years of intense scrutiny, they blocked the sale in June 2017. Instead, Walgreens was allowed to purchase a portion of Rite Aid's stores, 1,932 of them to be exact, for about $4.4 billion in cash. It was a devastating outcome for Rite Aid. They did get a cash infusion, but it was a tiny fraction of the money they needed to pay down its crippling debt. And now it was smaller, having lost nearly half its locations and with a weaker market presence than ever before. Then, just 1 year later in 2018, another chance for salvation appeared. The grocery giant Albertsons proposed a merger, a deal that would have combined Rite Aid's pharmacies with Albertsons supermarkets to create a new kind of health and wellness powerhouse. Again, it looked like a perfect escape route for Rite Aid. But again, it fell apart. Rite Aid's shareholders, skeptical of the deal's terms, revolted, and the merger was called off at the last minute. These two failed mergers weren't just missed opportunities, they were near fatal. The company was trapped, too small to compete, with remaining debt and mounting losses mounted. But an even more dangerous threat was just around the corner. As Rite Aid staggered from its failed mergers, it was hit by a tidal wave of litigation that would seal its fate. In March 2023, the U.S. Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against the company, accusing its pharmacists of knowingly filling hundreds of thousands of illegal prescriptions for controlled substances, including opioids. The lawsuit alleged that Rite Aid had repeatedly ignored red flags and had actively contributed to the opioid crisis. This wasn't just a public relations nightmare, it was a potential financial catastrophe. The company was now facing legal liability that could run into the billions, money it simply didn't have. With its $3.3 billion debt already choking the business, the opioid lawsuits were the final unbearable weight. While the legal battles raged, the business itself was falling apart. Not only was Rite Aid being squeezed by its giant rivals, CVS and Walgreens, but new players were entering the market. Amazon was building its own pharmacy business, while big box stores like Walmart and Costco were expanding their healthcare offerings. Rite Aid tried to enter the space by partnering with Amazon in 2019, allowing people to collect Amazon drug orders at Rite Aid stores, but that wasn't enough to keep them healthy. Rite Aid was losing on all fronts. Its smaller scale meant it had less bargaining power with drug suppliers, and it couldn't afford to invest in modernizing its stores or expanding into new health services like their competitors were doing. The company found itself in a death spiral where falling sales led to less cash for investment, which in turn led to an even worse customer experience and further sales declines. Then came the self-inflicted wounds. In December 2023, the Federal Trade Commission hit Rite Aid with a 5-year ban on using AI-powered facial recognition technology. An investigation found that the company's system was systematically and inaccurately flagging customers, particularly women and people of color, as shoplifters. The news created another firestorm of negative press, further eroding public trust in the struggling brand. The company was also caught up in recalls, including pulling certain eye drops from its shelves over contamination fears, and the losses were still piling up at an alarming rate. In April 2023, the company announced a quarterly loss of $241 million, or $4.39 per share, citing declining sales of COVID tests and vaccines. By the summer, it was clear that the company was on the brink of insolvency. The combination of crushing debt, fierce competition, and overwhelming legal exposure had become too much to bear. On October 15, 2023, Rite Aid filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing was a desperate attempt to restructure its massive debt and resolve the thousands of opioid-related lawsuits in one go. They announced that they'd be closing hundreds of its most underperforming stores to cut costs. As part of the bankruptcy, Rite Aid began shedding assets. It sold off its pharmacy benefit manager, Elixir, to MedImpact for $575 million in a deal that was approved by the B Bankruptcy Court on January 2024. It also began selling off other business units, like its Health Dialogue population health business. But these sales were like trying to shock someone back to life without a defibrillator. The core pharmacy business continued to lose money, and more stores were closed every month. In July 2024, they settled with the DOJ over the opioid accusations, agreeing to pay $7.5 million to the government straight away, and giving them a further claim to just over $400 million of the money available through Rite Aid's bankruptcy case. Despite all this, the company officially emerged from its first bankruptcy in September 2024, but it was a shadow of its former self. It was even smaller, even weaker, and still faced the same problems. The restructuring had bought it a little time, but it hadn't cured their underlying sickness. The business was unviable. The final act began in May 2025. Reports surfaced that Rite Aid was preparing to file for bankruptcy for a second time, a move that signaled the end was near. This time, there would be no restructuring. This was a liquidation. A bankruptcy court approved a fire sale of the company's remaining pharmacy assets. CVS and Walgreens, the rivals that had squeezed Rite Aid for decades, swooped in to pick over the carcass. CVS announced it would buy and run 64 of the remaining Rite Aid stores, primarily in the Pacific Northwest. But for the most part, the big chains weren't interested in the physical stores. They just wanted the customers. In a series of deals, the valuable customer data and prescription files for roughly 9 million of Rite Aid's patients were sold, mostly to CVS, who gained records from 63 locations, but also to Walgreens. People were told their prescriptions would be automatically transferred to a nearby CVS or Walgreens location. Then, on October 3, 2025, the final announcement came down. All remaining Rite Aid stores would be closed permanently. The company that had once boasted over 4,600 locations was gone. So, what ultimately killed Rite Aid? The opioid lawsuits were the immediate cause of death, the final blow that pushed a teetering company into the grave. But the reality is, Rite Aid had been suffering from a terminal illness for decades. The company was built on a foundation of debt, using financial leverage to pursue a strategy of growth at all costs. For years, it tried to keep up with its rivals by buying smaller chains, but it never bought enough and didn't quite get big enough to make the model work. It lacked the purchasing power of its bigger rivals, which meant it earned less profit on every prescription it filled. It couldn't afford to keep its stores open or invest in the new health services and technologies that were changing the industry. While CVS was transforming itself into a vertically integrated healthcare giant buying Aetna, Rite Aid was just trying to keep the lights on. Then, when the mergers collapsed, Rite Aid's fate was all but sealed. But the story of Rite Aid isn't just about opioids or bad management. It's a cautionary tale about a flawed business model built on debt, a model that dominated American retail for half a century. And as we watch Walgreens now facing its own problems, the lesson becomes terrifyingly clear. Rite Aid wasn't an anomaly, it was a warning. If you want to know more about what's going on at Walgreens, click my video here to find out.